You spot a completely unfamiliar dog, tied up outside a quiet coffee shop, an animal you have never encountered before in your entire existence, possessing no shared history, no mutual context, and not even a single moment of direct eye contact. Yet something incredibly primitive inside your biology shifts long before your conscious mind can form a single rational thought. Your knees instinctively bend, your hand reaches outward, and your voice drops into a soft, high-pitched, slightly ridiculous register that you would never dare use in a professional meeting, speaking to a stranger's leashed pet, as if you were greeting a newborn infant. And the strangest part of this whole interaction is how entirely natural it feels while it is happening, because this is not a personal quirk, it is not an animal person phase, and it is not a trait you can attribute to your specific upbringing, but rather a universal human reflex that manifests across every culture, every age group, and every demographic background that researchers have ever bothered to analyze. We reach out our hands to dogs, we reach for cats, we reach for rabbits, goats, guinea pigs, and occasionally even a massive, unbothered iguana resting at a reptile exhibition, completely unable to keep our hands to ourselves around anything covered in fur, feathers, or fuzz, an untaught compulsion that practically everyone experiences, yet almost no one stops long enough to truly question. The conventional explanation we routinely fall back on is that it simply comes down to personal taste, the casual assumption that some individuals are inherently animal lovers while others are not, as if this profound cross-species draw were merely a subjective preference rather than a deeply rooted biological mandate. But that casual framing completely disintegrates the moment you examine the physiological changes occurring inside the human body and brain in the fleeting seconds before your hand ever makes physical contact with that coat. Something vastly older and more powerful than personal preferences running the show, operating on nearly everyone in the exact same manner, regardless of whether they consider themselves an animal person or whether they grew up surrounded by nature or completely isolated in a concrete city. The immediate conclusion is that animals are simply cute, and humans possess a natural desire to touch appealing things. A deceptively simple answer that seems to close the case, except that this surface-level explanation completely falls apart the moment you analyze what the perception of cuteness actually does to the human neurological architecture. When your eyes land on a creature possessing a large forehead relative to its face, massive round eyes, a tiny nose, and soft, rounded features, your brain does not merely register a vague, pleasant emotion. It immediately drops into a highly specific, well-documented neurological state that was first structurally identified by an Austrian researcher named Konrad Lorenz in the 1940s. Lorenz described this phenomenon as Kindenschema, translated directly as baby schema, arguing that certain precise physical proportions and soft, uncoordinated movements evolved in human infants for the explicit evolutionary purpose of hijacking the adult brain, forcibly triggering an immediate, non-negotiable caregiving response by embedding an emotional exploit directly into the geometry of a baby's face. Lorenz's brilliant insight, decades ahead of the neuroimaging tools that would eventually validate it, was that these identical physical proportions trigger the exact same caregiving circuitry when they show up in a completely different animal species. Your brain does not execute a taxonomic species check before deciding whether to extend its empathy. It sees the mathematical proportions of the face, fires the ancient neural pathways, and delivers the exact same emotional payload, whether the creature standing before you is your biological child or a stranger's terrier on the sidewalk. Modern functional brain scans confirm this evolutionary reality with striking precision, showing that when subjects look at images of baby animals, neural activity instantly spikes within the orbitofrontal cortex alongside deep brain regions fundamentally tied to reward processing and emotional significance, proving that looking at something cute is never a passive, superficial experience, but a profound internal event where the brain treats the sight of a round-faced, big-eyed creature with the exact same biological urgency it reserves for things critical to the survival of the species. Long before your conscious mind has even formulated the sentence, "Look at that puppy," an ancient, involuntary signal has already betrayed your internal state through your eyes, because researchers tracking ocular movement and pupil responses have discovered that looking at infants or baby animals causes a measurable, immediate pupil dilation, a purely autonomous reaction produced entirely without your permission, proving that your body casts its vote of attraction well before your intellect has finished forming an opinion. But the visual trigger is merely the opening act of an entirely separate, highly sophisticated sensory system stacked directly underneath your skin, because human touch is not a singular, uniform sense but rather a complex collection of parallel neural highways running through your tissue, each wired with different receptors to map pressure, vibration, texture, and temperature. One specific category of nerve fibers, studied extensively by neuroscientists including Francis McGlone, is known as C-tactile afferents, and these specialized nerves are tuned, with astonishing perfection, to one highly precise type of physical contact, slow, gentle stroking, falling strictly within the range of 1 to 10 centimeters per second. If the touch is too fast, too sharp, or too forceful, these fibers remain completely silent, but when they are activated by the right velocity, the resulting electrical signal does not just travel to the somatosensory cortex to map where you were touched. It bypasses the cold data centers and journeys directly to the brain regions responsible for processing emotion, social bonding, and neurological reward. What makes these C-tactile afferents uniquely fascinating is their primitive construction, lacking the fast, heavily insulated myelin sheaths that characterize the nerves, reporting sharp tactile details, meaning they are explicitly designed not to tell your brain the precise spatial location of a touch, but to deliver an emotional message, which is precisely why running your fingers through an animal's fur never feels like cold physical data. It feels like pure, unadulterated comfort. When you connect this underlying neural machinery to the physical texture of fur, you realize that running your hand across a soft, yielding coat activates these C-tactile afferents as efficiently as any material found in the natural world, matching their biological tuning perfectly through a combination of texture, gentle give, and radiant warmth. The moment you pet a dog, you are directly activating an ancient pathway that originally evolved to facilitate human-to-human social bonding, now firing wildly because of a golden retriever standing on a street corner. A reaction that is not a poetic exaggeration, but a highly measurable biochemical reality driven by a cascade of oxytocin, frequently burdened with the simplistic nickname of the love hormone, a label that neuroscientists find somewhat embarrassing given the sheer complexity of its biological functions. Oxytocin floods the system during physical affection. Whether you are hugging a loved one, holding an infant, or sitting closely with a partner, multiple rigorously controlled studies have demonstrated that a remarkably brief window of interaction with a dog, petting its coat, maintaining direct eye contact, or simply sitting in its immediate presence provokes an immediate, significant jump in oxytocin levels within the human bloodstream. And the detail that makes this interaction almost unfair in its pure wholesomeness is that the dog's oxytocin levels spike at the exact same time. Two completely separate nervous systems, representing entirely different evolutionary histories, lifespans, and structures, lock into the exact same mutual bonding chemistry simultaneously over a casual encounter on a sidewalk, meaning you briefly, biologically fell a little bit in love with a stranger's dog, and that dog fell right back in love with you. An automatic reaction requiring no shared language, no mutual understanding of context, and no complex negotiation, demanding nothing more than basic proximity, gentleness, and a few moments of shared time. If you step back to look at the wider evolutionary picture, you have to ask why our biology favors softness specifically, and why a smooth, perfectly shaped stone fails to elicit this intense emotional reaction, a preference that traces directly back to the earliest stages of mammalian development, where infants spend an immense portion of their formative existence pressed firmly against warm, soft surfaces like skin, maternal bodies, and protective nests long before conscious memory or formal language ever exist. To categorize the experience, wiring the sensation of softness directly to the concept of absolute safety at the deepest foundational level of the nervous system. Temperature works in tandem with this tactile architecture, because physical warmth signals aliveness at an automatic, subconscious level, meaning that when you rest your hand on a warm, slightly yielding animal body, your biological stress markers begin to drop almost immediately. Your heart rate eases, your skin conductance falls, and your systemic cortisol levels begin a steady decline. A relaxation response that isn't a conscious choice, but your body recognizing ambient warmth as evidence of a friendly living presence nearby, and quietly dialing down its internal threat radar. This sensory orchestration extends into the realm of sound, particularly when you examine the acoustic biology of the domestic cat's purr, a phenomenon that becomes increasingly strange the more closely researchers analyze it, produced by rapid, repeated contractions of the internal muscles surrounding the voice box that vibrate dozens of times every second on both the inhale and the exhale to generate a continuous low-frequency rumble. The purr of a domestic cat typically registers between 25 and 150 Hz, falling most commonly within the 25 to 50 Hz band, which happens to be the exact frequency window shown in clinical research to actively promote bone healing, reduce inflammation, and accelerate soft tissue repair. There are specialized physical therapy devices engineered explicitly to deliver mechanical vibrations within this precise frequency range to help human patients recover from fractures and muscle tears, meaning that a cat curled up silently on your chest, seemingly ignoring your entire existence, is quietly vibrating your body at frequencies your internal tissues naturally respond to, proving that felines are accidentally therapeutic while doing absolutely nothing on purpose. The absolute strangest piece of this evolutionary puzzle is the compulsive, almost uncontrollable nature of this drive, because experiencing a warm feeling around a cute animal is one thing, but successfully managing to override that instinct in a polite public setting is a separate cognitive skill entirely, and a massive portion of the human population simply does not possess it. Reaching out to touch a pet even when they intellectually know they should ask the owner first, or trying to stroke a friend's cat that has already sent multiple clear signals of wanting to be left alone. This boundary-crossing behavior is driven by approach motivation, the ancient neural circuitry that powerfully pulls you toward food when you are starving, or toward a partner you find intensely attractive, so that when your brain flags an object as rewarding, cute, warm, and soft, it checks every single box that this ancient survival circuitry looks for, generating an intense physical pull that bypasses conscious reflection, sending your hand into motion before the conscious sentence "I want to pet that animal" has even fully formed in your consciousness. This overwhelming neurological overload frequently manifests as a psychological phenomenon known as cute aggression, an alarming phrase that describes the strange, paradoxical urge to tightly squeeze a puppy's face, clench your jaw, or exclaim that you could just eat a kitten up, despite having zero actual intention of causing harm to any living thing. Researchers at major universities studying this exact behavior have confirmed it is not a random psychological glitch but a vital regulatory response engineered by the brain to counterbalance an intense emotional reaction that is running much hotter than the nervous system can gracefully process, acting as a cognitive release valve to let an overwhelming wave of tenderness drain away before it completely paralyzes the individual, with data showing that people who experience strong cute aggression exhibit a much faster emotional recovery afterward. This deep-seated drive toward cross-species connection is not a uniquely human invention, as animal behaviorists tracking primates in the wild have documented great apes approaching entirely different species to interact with them in ways that serve no practical survival purpose, handling small creatures with immense care, engaging in clear play behaviors, and demonstrating an unmistakable capacity for curiosity and gentleness. This cross-species empathy was demonstrated most profoundly in the famous case of Coco the gorilla, who was taught a modified version of sign language over decades of research and insisted on keeping several domestic cats as pets throughout her lifetime, requesting them by name, using signs she invented herself, treating them with consistent, delicate tenderness, and displaying clear, recognizable signs of deep psychological grief when one of her feline companions tragically died, proving that the emotional value of cross-species touch runs far deeper into the primate family tree than our modern human ego usually assumes. To truly comprehend why this bond feels so unbreakable, we have to look directly at the long history of coevolution. Because the relationship between humans and dogs did not develop by chance, but was forged across a massive window estimated between 15,000 and 40,000 years of living, hunting, and sleeping side by side. A vast stretch of time that allowed two entirely different species to physically and neurologically reshape one another. Dogs possess an uncanny, evolved ability to read human social cues that is entirely missing in their closest wild relatives. Even wolves raised by human hands from birth cannot follow a pointed finger, track human eye movements, or make sustained eye contact in the unique, communicative way that domestic dogs do naturally. This specialized eye contact triggers the exact bidirectional oxytocin loop that locks our species together, a biological contract that is written directly into the facial anatomy of the dog, because researchers have discovered that domestic dogs possess a specialized facial muscle called the levator anguli oculi medialis, a muscle that is completely absent or barely functional in wild wolves. This specific muscle serves no purpose other than to raise the inner brow of the dog, producing the classic, vulnerable puppy dog eyes expression that mimics the facial proportions of a human infant and causes something in the human chest to immediately give way, proving that dogs evolved actual physical anatomy for the explicit purpose of triggering our warmth, caregiving, and feeding behaviors. This was not a passive process of domestication where humans dictated all the terms, but an active multi-millennial negotiation where humans and dogs effectively domesticated each other, a selective pressure that shows up clearly in the physical shape of modern dog breeds. For generations, human breeders have consistently favored rounder skulls, larger eyes, and softer, more juvenile facial proportions, effectively locking a permanent, adult version of Kindenschema onto a fully grown animal's face, so that the biological trigger never fades. With age, this underlying psychological trigger is so powerful that it has completely conquered the modern consumer market, driving the massive industry for oversized, round-faced plush toys targeted explicitly at adults, who spend real money on inanimate objects designed with the exact facial geometry and ultra-soft textures described by Lorenz nearly a century ago, seeking a caregiving outlet that their nervous systems cannot easily distinguish from a real living creature. This deep need for tactile connection plays out in profound clinical settings, evidenced by the dramatic growth of equine therapy programs designed specifically for military veterans navigating the complexities of post-traumatic stress disorder, where a massive portion of the documented psychological healing does not come from the act of riding, but from the slow, repetitive meditative act of running a brush across a horse's massive coat, interacting with an animal large enough to make its calm, grounded presence physically undeniable. Causes veterans to consistently report dramatic drops in baseline anxiety and significant improvements in sleep architecture, while researchers tracking their physiology document the exact same shifts in oxytocin and cortisol seen on the sidewalk, triggered this time by a creature the size of a small car. Even when there is no physical animal present in the room, the human craving for this specific type of sensory soothing is so intense that millions of people actively seek out digital proxies online, turning ASMR videos featuring soft brushing sounds, slow stroking motions, and gentle, focused attention into one of the most widely consumed content categories on the internet, effectively chasing a screen-based simulation of the tactile comfort an animal would provide. The widespread commercial success of weighted blankets follows this identical evolutionary logic, offering firm, even sustained pressure across the human body that mimics the primal physiological sensation of being held, huddled in a pack, or pressed against something warm. Marketed entirely on the biological promise of calming an overstimulated modern nervous system down, none of these modern products invented a new human need. They simply engineered new ways to satisfy an incredibly ancient one that has been left starving by the structure of modern society, a reality that became undeniably clear during recent periods of enforced global isolation, where individuals sharing their homes with pets consistently reported vastly better mental health outcomes, lower baseline stress, and significantly reduced rates of anxiety and depression compared to those living completely alone. When researchers explicitly tested whether this benefit stemmed from simple companionship or from the physical act of touch itself, the data increasingly pointed to touch as a distinct, powerful therapeutic factor of its own, showing that structured animal visits in hospital settings reliably lower reported physical pain, reduce pre-procedure terror, and accelerate emotional recovery, while therapy dogs introduced into schools cause a measurable drop in student stress hormones during high-pressure examinations. The timeline for this biochemical recalibration is astonishingly fast, requiring a mere 10 to 15 minutes of direct physical contact with an animal to produce statistically significant drops in cortisol and spikes in oxytocin, proving that your nervous system does not waste time deciding what it needs. It recognizes the signal of safety instantly and responds the moment it receives it. We frequently treat our sudden, overwhelming urge to pet every animal we encounter as a funny personality flaw, a silly habit that makes you late for an appointment because you were waylaid by a puppy on the sidewalk. But what this behavioral glitch is actually revealing is something infinitely older, deeper, and more serious than a casual quirk. Physical touch is the primary wordless medium through which mammals signal absolute safety to one another, serving as a foundational mechanism that nervous systems use to co-regulate each other without exchanging a single spoken syllable, acting as a deep, biological declaration of mutual presence and peace. For nearly the entire historical span of the human species, our ancestors lived in close, constant, unavoidable physical contact with the animal world, working beasts, farm animals, and hunting companions that slept directly alongside the group for shared warmth, security, and survival. The sterile, clean separation that we now consider normal between the human world and the animal kingdom is an incredibly recent, unnatural development on an evolutionary timescale, and our ancient mammalian nervous systems have absolutely not caught up to this artificial isolation. We are still deeply expecting regular, rhythmic contact with something warm, soft and alive, meaning that your impulse to crouch down on a public sidewalk and make high-pitched noises at a dog you met 4 seconds ago is not an embarrassing loss of control, but one of the most honest, unfiltered biological reactions left in modern life, proving that underneath the civilized version of yourself that answers corporate emails and sits quietly through meetings, there is still an ancient nervous system quietly scanning every room, every street corner, and every sidewalk, searching for something warm and soft enough to reach toward.